This is Lesson 27.5, the Second World War. How did Germany and Japan conquer enormous empires during World War II, and how did the Allies defeat them? College Board Topic 8.8, World War II, explain how technology and innovation affected the course of World War II and the 20th century. Germany's Blitzkrieg warfare in Europe, combined with Japan's attacks in Asia and the Pacific, brought the Axis powers early victories. American and British industrial, scientific, and technological power, cooperative military efforts under the strong leadership of individuals such as Winston Churchill, the resistance of civilians, and the all-out military commitment of the USSR contributed critically to the Allied victories. Military technologies made possible industrialized warfare, genocide, nuclear proliferation, and the risk of global nuclear war. College Board Topic 8.9, the Holocaust. Explain how and why cultural and national identities were affected by war and the rise of fascist totalitarian powers in the period 1914 to the present. Fueled by racism and anti-Semitism, Nazi Germany, with the cooperation of some of the other Axis powers and collaborationist governments, sought to establish a new racial order in Europe, which culminated with the Holocaust. World War II decimated a generation of Russian and German men, virtually destroyed European Jewry, resulted in the murder of millions in other groups targeted by the Nazis, including the Roma, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and others, forced large-scale migrations, and undermined pre-war class hierarchies. Place: the entire world. It's World War II. Time frame: 1939 to 1945. Key people of the Second World War: Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Harry S. Truman. Key concepts of the Second World War: Blitzkrieg, the Battle of Britain, the New Order, Untermensch, and the Holocaust. Intro. The Nazis unleashed an apocalyptic cataclysm. Hitler established a huge fascist empire in Europe dominated by death and destruction. Japan built a huge racial empire in Southeast Asia dominated by death and destruction. An unlikely set of allies wound up determined to work together to halt the aggression: the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States. This grand alliance eventually defeated the evil. German victories in Europe. Poland was conquered in just 4 weeks after Germany attacked on September 1st, 1939. Poland was a joint endeavor between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Soviets took the Baltic states also. Germany and the Soviets had signed their Non-aggression Pact in August. The Soviets signed it because it promised them more territory. Great Britain and France declared war 2 days later. Then the war actually took some months to really heat up. This map shows the mutual invasion of Poland. The Germans used their Blitzkrieg tactic for the first time in Poland. It literally means lightning war. In Blitzkrieg, you take advantage of the speed of your vehicles and drive, ride, and fly as fast as you can through the enemy's territory before they can set up a defense against you. The Germans used this to great effect in several countries. But practically nothing else in the war happened, at least on land, until the spring of 1940. Then you had an explosion of Nazi invasions: Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France. The British stationed in France barely escaped at Dunkirk. Watch the movie. Germany actually had allies at this time: Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. There were 3 main friendly neutrals in the war: Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain, plus quite a few more minor ones. Great Britain and the Balkan countries stood alone against this Nazi empire. The Battle of Britain. Once again, see the movie. Hitler planned an invasion of Britain. In July of 1940, Hitler began a campaign to soften British defenses in preparation for the assault. He sent over 1,000 bombers per day over Britain to bomb military targets. The British scrambled every day in fighters and shot down as many German planes as they could, as fast as they could. And this was every day for 8 long months. The Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. These 2 British fighters were produced in roughly equal numbers during the war. It's commonly believed that Hawker Hurricanes were far more prevalent in the Battle of Britain than the Spitfire. Hurricanes were responsible for about 60% of the enemy kills during the Battle of Britain. But this may have been because the Spitfire was the superior plane and was directed more against German fighters, while the Hurricanes concentrated on the bombers. By September 1940, Hitler was frustrated by heavy losses, and he ordered his bombers to bomb British towns and cities. Every major city in Britain suffered massive damage. Many of the poorer cities didn't recover for many years. Hitler wanted to use terror to break the will of the British people. But the people of Britain dug in, and by October, British planes were shooting down German planes at a rate of 3-1. Hitler had to call off the battle and rethink invading Britain. So he went after Greece and the Balkans instead. The Blitz. Here are some pictures of British people enduring the Blitz, the Battle of Britain. You see one picture of them sheltering in a subway tunnel. There's another picture of a lady drinking tea on a pile of rubble. She's just not going to stop being English. The invasion of the Soviet Union. Wait, didn't Germany and the Soviet Union have a Non-aggression Pact? Didn't they work together to invade Poland? Yes, but Hitler broke that Non-aggression Pact in June of 1941. Hitler's greatest dream was of an Eastern European empire ruled and populated by the master race. By October, the Germans were laying siege to Moscow. Winter stopped but did not destroy the invasion. Hitler, his Nazi party, and the army were now ready to ramp up what was called the New Order. And you can see the invasion of the Soviet Union. It went a long way if it got to Moscow. Europe under Nazi occupation, the German New Order. Occupied peoples were treated according to their place in the Nazi racial hierarchy. For example, Nordic peoples got preferential treatment since they were related to the Aryan race. Roman peoples, like the French, were tolerated. Eastern Europeans and Jews were considered Untermenschen, subhuman. The word Untermensch is the opposite of the word Nietzsche used, Übermensch. So an Untermensch is a subhuman, and an Übermensch is a fully self-actualized person. Untermenschen received brutal treatment, and they were deemed worthy only of slavery and annihilation. Conquered lands were blatantly plundered for the sole enrichment of Germany in every conceivable way. Occupied countries had to pay the cost of their own occupation. German soldiers were encouraged to steal and buy at favorable rates. Currencies were manipulated in Germany's favor. Nazi administrators stole goods and money from Jews and Eastern Europeans. The shipment of all these things back to Germany ensured that Germany had a high standard of living well into the war. Mass settlement space. The war in the East was a war of annihilation from the start. The first goal was to exterminate Jews immediately. The next goal was to enslave and force to die out all other subhumans, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, etc. And this would provide a, quote, mass settlement space, unquote, to be settled by racially pure German peasants. This was carried out by a force of Nazi administrators, police, and elite SS corps, supported by the army. Armies destroyed entire cities and factories, stole crops and animals. They committed forced starvation and the mass murder of millions. Popular resistance. Resistance groups fought the Nazis throughout Europe. There was often much disagreement among these groups. Nationalist and centralist groups conflicted with socialist and communist groups. Many groups disagreed over tactics. Sometimes they even fought each other instead of the Nazis. Resistance groups didn't just fight. They had underground newspapers. They had secret university classes. They conducted espionage. They passed information to the Allies. German reprisals were extremely brutal. Entire towns were leveled to the ground in response to resistance attacks. Entire male populations were murdered in towns in France and Czechoslovakia. The Holocaust. This process developed in stages as the war developed. The Holocaust began with the euthanasia campaign from 1938 to 1940. These were mostly ethnic Germans with physical and mental disabilities. About 70,000 people were murdered. Many were children. The Nazis deemed them, quote, unworthy lives, unquote. It was finally stopped by the church and by public outcry. But the euthanasia campaign provided the Nazis with the learning and experience necessary for the Holocaust. Then the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939. 3 million Jews were suddenly under their control, far more than the number of Jews in Germany. And at first, the Jews were forced into walled ghettos. And these ghettos were in large and small cities. They were crowded and filthy. There was no means of surviving. 500,000 people died in the ghettos. See a movie called Europa, Europa for an amazing depiction of these ghettos. Then the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. They encountered many more Jews there. The Nazis organized large death squads known as Einsatzgruppen, special task forces. They were mobile killing units. They would come in behind the advancing regular army. They would target Jewish and other undesirable populations within the territory. And they would force their victims to dig their own mass graves. And they murdered about 2 million civilians. Up in the top right, you have a picture of a mass grave. And the picture below it is a haunting one. And it speaks to not only the brutality, but also the sheer insanity, the madness, and the absurdity of the Holocaust. It was shot in Latvia by a spectator who was there to see the action. And you wonder how it was set up. Did he say to these women, hey, before you get brutally murdered, do you mind taking a pose for me? I want to capture this moment. Late in 1941, Hitler ordered the SS, that's the Schutzstaffel, to implement mass murder of all Jews in Europe. Nazi leadership called this the final solution of the Jewish question. They set up a Europe-wide industrialized killing complex of concentration camps, labor camps, and railroad transportation lines. Surviving residents of ghettos were also rounded up and put on trains. And this continued long after Germany knew it was going to lose the war. Here's some other pictures of children burn victims. They're the victims of scientific experiments. This picture on the top middle is amazing. Here are two people, a woman and a child, posing for a picture, seemingly not really even conscious of the fact that there are dead bodies lying around all around them. Same with the picture on the bottom right. You've got a soldier getting his picture taken in front of a truck, seemingly unconcerned with the fact that it's loaded with dead bodies. And at the top right, you've got an Auschwitz victim who actually survived the ordeal. In fact, here she is on this slide at the top right. The Holocaust was the ultimate racial hygiene. By 1945, the Nazis had killed 6 million Jews. They also killed 5 million other Europeans, especially Russians and especially Poles. Why did otherwise ordinary people like you and me do this? Some possible theories: widely shared anti-Semitism, heightened peer pressure, the desire for advancement, and racist propaganda. One of the things we're going to find out is that German people were not the only ones fully capable of this kind of atrocity. The Japanese Empire and the war in the Pacific. Japan had some similarities with Germany and Italy. Fascism had taken over after economic crisis in the 1930s. The government was highly nationalistic and militaristic. and the government was committed to imperial expansion. It had a race theory in which the Asian races were far superior to the Western races. They glorified war and sacrifice. They had extreme anti-Western views. Their proclaimed mission was to liberate East Asia from Western imperial powers. Japanese expansion into East Asia. Japan expanded into Manchuria in 1931. In 1937, it expanded into China itself. They committed brutal atrocities. They killed 300,000 innocent civilians in Nanking alone. You can also call it Nanjing with a J. Pictures of the Rape of Nanjing are too gruesome to show. In 1941, the Japanese occupied southern portions of French Indochina. In 1940, Japan entered into a formal alliance with Germany and Italy. And here we see a map of much of the Pacific Theater. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The Japanese sold their expansionism under the slogan Asia for Asians. Japanese propaganda claimed that Japan was actually freeing East Asia from hated Western imperialists. Their efforts were supposedly for the greater benefit of all East Asians. This was actually a pretext for brutalizing and exploiting all the territories they conquered. However, they did show East Asia that Western powers could be defeated, and this would become very important after the war. Pearl Harbor had been considered impossible to attack. It was too far away from Japan. Pearl Harbor was considered too shallow to attack ships with torpedo bombers. But in November of 1940, the British carried out Operation Judgment in the Mediterranean Sea. They launched just 21 Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers from the British carrier Illustrious. They put half of the Italian Navy's battleships out of action in just one attack at Taranto Harbor. They lost only 2 planes of the 21. And Taranto Harbor was very similar to Pearl Harbor. This got the Japanese attention. They analyzed the British attack on Taranto very thoroughly, and they figured out how the British pulled it off. The provocation of the United States. FDR responded very sharply to Japanese expansionism with trade embargoes, aid to Japanese enemies, especially China. The Japanese, believing that a direct confrontation with the U.S. was inevitable, launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Their expansion continued until 1942 and included U.S. territories. In a long series of savage, large-scale battles, the U.S. and its allies pushed back the Japanese expansion. Fighting was characterized as a war without mercy and featured intense mutual hatred, extreme violence, atrocities, and dehumanization. The hinge of fate. Ironically, the Allies didn't really like or trust each other. This distrust was alleviated by concentrating on the priorities that all three could agree upon. Number 1, win in Europe first. Hitler was the greater threat. Defeat him first, then concentrate on Japan. Number 2, focus on military victory now and ideological questions later. Number 3, nothing less than unconditional surrender would be accepted by anybody. That way, Hitler would have no opportunity to divide the Allies with any kind of separate peace agreement. Allied turning points. The Second Battle of Alamein in 1942 was a major turning point. This was in Egypt, and in this battle, the British managed to halt German expansion into North Africa. This battle was what Churchill called the hinge of fate. African territories that were held by the French Vichy, that's the German puppet Nazi French government, went over to the Allies. And this facilitated Allied expansion into Italy in 1943. New anti-submarine technologies enabled shipping to take advantage of U.S. industrial power to supply the other two allies with major material needs. The German Luftwaffe never recovered from its losses in the Battle of Britain. This enabled the U.S. and Britain to control the air. The Allies could now bomb and destroy German cities relentlessly. Major Soviet victories. At Stalingrad, the Soviets destroyed the German Sixth Army of 300,000 in November of 1942. At the end of the battle, there were only 125,000 Germans left to surrender. By the summer of 1943, the Soviet army was larger and better equipped than the German army. Allied victory. Germany still had a lot of fighting capability after these losses. And in 1941, Germany had still not fully mobilized its economy and industry for war. Germany, with Albert Speer as Minister of Armaments, stepped up its efforts. It fought hard for another 2 years. German war production actually tripled from early 1942 to July 1944. Unfortunately, there weren't enough men left to drive all those tanks and trucks. This war production was even done with constant bombing raids. D-Day, June 6, 1944. The Allies made a successful assault on German-held French beaches. This opened up a second front for Germany, and the Soviets had been begging its allies in the West to do this for years. American and British troops crossed the Rhine and into Germany in March 1945. The Allies completely captured Italy in the spring of 1945. Italian communist partisans captured and executed Mussolini and his mistress. The Soviet advance. The Eastern Front was a vast theater of war in itself. The Soviets began advancing steadily westward in 1943. The Red Army reached the edge of Warsaw in August of 1944. The Polish underground Home Army thought that the Soviets would aid them, and so they launched the Warsaw Uprising against their German occupiers. The Red Army sat and waited while the Germans annihilated the Home Army and destroyed the city. About 150,000 to 200,000 Poles were killed, and the Red Army continued its advance. The Red Army advanced through Romania, Hungary, and Yugoslavia during late 1944 and early 1945, and didn't leave again for decades. They entered Germany in January 1945. They met American troops on the Elbe River on April 26, 1945. The Red Army entered Berlin in May, and Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. Germany surrendered on May the 8th, 1945, and this date is known as VE Day, Victory Europe. The surrender of Japan. By the summer of 1945, Japan was finished and helpless. However, they seemed determined to fight on regardless of the losses. American commanders estimated that an invasion would be very costly, about 1 million American lives and about 10 to 20 million Japanese lives. Harry Truman reluctantly decided to use the atom bomb on 2 Japanese cities to force a surrender. And it worked. Japan surrendered on August the 14th, 1945. In total, the war had cost over 50 million lives.